Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive. Today we're going back in time to explore America between 1870 and 1920, a period that saw the Victorian era give way to the rise of the progressive movement. It was a time of really dramatic transformations, industrialization, mass immigration, massive social upheaval. We'll be using Michael McGerr's book, A Fierce Discontent, as our main source for this exploration. It's a really insightful look at how Americans grappled with all these changes and how they ultimately set the stage for the 20th century. It should be a fascinating journey.
It's funny how we often think of the Victorian era as this time of elegance and refinement, right? But those grand mansions and fancy parties. But McGerr really peels back the layers to reveal a much more complicated and honestly pretty troubling reality.
Oh, yeah. Like what? Give me an example.
Well, one of the things that McGerr really highlights is this incredible economic disparity that existed during this period. The gap between the rich and the poor was just astronomical.
Okay, so how bad are we talking?
We're talking about a situation where the top 1% of the population controlled over 2/3 of the nation's wealth. I mean, that's mind-blowing.
Wow. That's a huge concentration of wealth in the hands of very few. It's like a different world.
Exactly. And we're talking about figures like John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, who amassed fortunes worth hundreds of millions of dollars, while working-class families, many of the recent immigrants, were barely scraping by on a few dollars a day.
That's a pretty stark contrast. I can see why there was fierce discontent brewing under the surface.
Exactly. And what's really fascinating is how McGerr shows that Victorian ideals themselves, those values that were supposed to be about, morality and order, actually ended up contributing to this discontent.
Now that's interesting. I mean, how could Victorian ideals, which we think of as kind of, straight-laced and all about hard work, how could that lead to discontent?
Well, think about the emphasis on self-restraint and hard work. On the surface, those seem like positive values, right?
Yeah, I mean, they're often seen as the keys to success.
But when you have this massive economic inequality,
Yeah.
these values take on a different meaning. For the working class, no amount of hard work could realistically lift them out of poverty.
Yeah, because the system is kind of rigged against them.
Exactly. And meanwhile, the wealthy elite could use these very same values to justify their own privilege and even blame the poor for their circumstance.
Oh, so it's like a double-edged sword. These values that are supposed to be about virtue are actually being used to perpetuate inequality.
Exactly. And then you have this whole ideal of domesticity, which was so central to Victorian culture, this idea that a woman's place was in the home, nurturing her family.
Right, the angel in the house.
Exactly. But for the wealthy elite, this was achievable. They had servants to help manage the household and could afford to stay home.
Yeah, so they had the means to actually live out that ideal.
But for working-class women, this ideal was often impossible. Many of them had to work outside the home to contribute to the family income, which created this real tension between what society expected of them and the reality of their lives.
It's like they were being held to a standard that was completely unattainable for them.
Right. And this created a sense of frustration and resentment, particularly among working-class women, which, as we'll see, played a really significant role in fueling the progressive movement.
I'm starting to see how these Victorian ideals, while seemingly about order and morality, could actually backfire in a society with such deep economic divisions. It's like they're creating this pressure cooker of discontent that's just waiting to explode.
That's a great analogy. And explode it did in the form of the progressive movement. Now, it's important to note that this wasn't just one single movement with a unified agenda. It was more like a collection of different groups and individuals all united by this shared belief that something needed to change.
Okay, so if it's not a single unified movement, what were some of the common threads that tied all these different progressive groups together?
Well, one of the most important threads was this belief in the power of collective action. The idea that people could achieve more by working together than they could alone.
So it's kind of a shift from every man for himself to we're all in this together.
Exactly. And another key thread was this deep concern for social justice. The progressives were really troubled by the poverty, inequality, and exploitation they saw all around them. They believed that everyone deserved a chance to thrive, regardless of their background or circumstances.
So they're pushing back against this idea that poverty is a personal failing, which was a very common Victorian belief, and instead seeing it as a systemic problem.
Precisely. They're looking at the bigger picture and saying, hey, something's wrong with the system itself as so many people are struggling.
That's a huge shift in thinking. It sounds like the progressives were almost like a counterculture going against the grain of the Victorian establishment.
In many ways, they were.
Mhm.
And they challenged that establishment on a number of fronts, from advocating for child labor laws and workplace safety regulations to fighting for women's suffrage and political reform.
Wow. So they weren't just focused on one issue. It seems like they were trying to tackle a whole range of social problems.
They were. And what's interesting is that their strategies varied widely, too. Some progressives, like Jane Addams, focused on providing direct services to the poor through settlement houses.
So it's like a hands-on approach, meeting people's immediate needs while also working for broader social change.
Exactly. Others, like the muckraking journalists, used their writing to expose corruption and injustice, hoping to mobilize public opinion and force those in power to act.
Ah, so it's like using the power of the pen to bring about change. I can see how that would be effective, especially back then when newspapers were the main source of information.
Absolutely. And then you have figures like Carrie Nation, who took a much more, well, let's say a more dramatic and confrontational approach.
Oh, yeah, Carrie Nation, the one who went around smashing up saloons with a hatchet.
That's the one. She was a passionate advocate for temperance, believing that alcohol was the root of many social ills.
I can see how that kind of in-your-face activism would get people's attention, but it also seems like it could be pretty divisive.
It definitely was. And it actually highlights an important point about the progressive movement. While they shared this common desire for social change, they didn't always agree on the best way to achieve it. There was a lot of internal debate and disagreement within the movement.
So it wasn't all kumbaya and holding hands for a better world. They had their own internal conflicts and differences of opinion.
Exactly. And those conflicts are important to understand because they reflect the complexity of the issues they were grappling with and the challenges of bringing about meaningful social change. It wasn't always a clear-cut black and white situation.
You know, it's interesting how McGerr uses Carrie Nation's story as a way to highlight these internal tensions within the progressive movement. Why do you think he chose to focus on her? What does her story reveal about the movement as a whole?
That's a great question. And I think it reveals a few things. First, it shows just how passionate these reformers were, how deeply they believed in their cause. Carrie Nation wasn't just some, cook running around smashing things for the fun of it. She was a woman driven by a profound moral conviction, even if her methods were extreme.
Right, she truly believed she was doing the right thing, even if it meant breaking the law.
Exactly. And second, I think her story highlights the diversity of tactics within the progressive movement. You have some who are working within the system trying to pass laws and reform institutions, and then you have others like Carrie Nation who are taking a more radical approach, directly challenging social norms and provoking a reaction.
So it's like a two-pronged approach, trying to bring about change from both inside and outside the system.
Exactly. And third, I think Carrie Nation's story highlights the challenges of bringing about social change. Even with the best of intentions, there will always be resistance and there will always be unintended consequences.
Yeah, that's so true. Even if you're fighting for something you believe is right, there's no guarantee that it will be easy or that everyone will agree with you. And even if you succeed, there might be unexpected downsides that you didn't anticipate.
Exactly. And I think those are lessons that are just as relevant today as they were back then.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got this backdrop of Victorian America, stark inequality, discontent simmering beneath the surface, and then these Victorian values that both fuel the discontent and become a target for the progressives. And to this steps, a diverse group of reformers with a shared desire for change but different ideas about how to get there. And all of this is going to lead to what we know as the progressive era. Did I get that right?
You got it. And what's so compelling about McGerr's book is that he doesn't just tell us what happened. He really delves into the why and the how, giving us a deeper understanding of the motivations and beliefs that drove both sides of this story.
It's like we're getting a peek behind the curtain, seeing the human side of history.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes this era so relevant to us today.
Yeah.
Because while the specific issues might be different, the underlying questions about social justice, economic inequality, and the role of government are still very much with us.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, what would those progressives think if they could see our world today? Would they be impressed by the progress we've made, or would they be disappointed by how far we still have to go?
That's a great question to ponder as we continue our deep dive.
Yeah.
And I think McGerr's book provides some really valuable insights that can help us answer it.
Okay, so we set the stage with this portrait of Victorian America and the rise of the progressive movement. I'm hooked. What happens next? What specific reforms did the progressives champion, and how did they manage to bring about change in the face of such entrenched opposition? Let's dive into that in part 2.
All right, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of the progressive era. the reforms themselves. Now remember, this wasn't a monolithic movement. We had a whole bunch of different reformers all tackling a wide range of issues.
Right. We talked about that, settlement houses, muckraking journalists, even Carrie Nation with her more direct approach. But what were some of the big changes they were pushing for? What were their main goals?
One of their central goals was to try and curb the power of big business. They saw these massive corporations, these monopolies in many cases, as a threat to democracy and to the well-being of average Americans.
So they were basically taking on those Rockefellers and Carnegies we talked about earlier. That must have been a pretty daunting task.
Oh, absolutely. They were going up against some of the most powerful figures in the country. But the progressives believed that the government had a responsibility to regulate these corporations, to ensure fair competition, and to protect workers and consumers.
So what were some of the specific reforms they pushed for in this area?
Well, they advocated for things like antitrust laws to break up monopolies so that no single company could control an entire industry. They also fought for things like minimum wage laws, maximum working hours, workplace safety regulations, all these things aimed at improving the lives of workers.
It sounds like they were trying to level the playing field a bit, give ordinary people more of a voice and a chance to get ahead.
Exactly. They believed in a more equitable distribution of wealth and power. It wasn't about tearing down the wealthy. It was about creating a system where everyone had the opportunity to succeed.
And this whole idea of government intervention in the economy, wasn't that a pretty radical concept back then? I mean, wasn't the prevailing philosophy more laissez-faire, let the market do its thing?
It was definitely a departure from the prevailing economic thought at the time. Laissez-faire basically means hands off, keep the government out of the economy. But the progressives argued that government intervention was necessary to protect the public good and to ensure fairness.
So basically saying that sometimes the government needs to step in to protect people from being exploited by those with more power and wealth.
Precisely. They believed that a truly free market required certain safeguards to prevent abuses and to ensure that everyone had a fair shot.
Okay, so tackling big business and economic inequality was a major focus for the progressives.
Yeah.
What about social reforms? What were they doing to address things like poverty and lack of opportunity?
One of the most significant social reforms of the progressive era was the settlement house movement.
Yeah.
These were community centers, often located in poor immigrant neighborhoods that offered a wide range of services.
Like what kind of services?
Look, things like childcare, education, healthcare, job training, you name it. The idea was to provide a holistic approach to helping people improve their lives.
So it's not just about giving people handouts, but about empowering them to lift themselves out of poverty by giving them the tools and resources they need.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that women played a really critical role in the settlement house movement and in the progressive era as a whole.
Oh, yeah. I was just thinking about that. It seems like a lot of the big names in the movement, like Jane Addams, for example, were women.
You're right. And there's a reason for that. Remember we talked about how Victorian ideals limited women's opportunities and created this sense of discontent? Well, many women saw the progressive movement as a way to channel that discontent into meaningful action.
So it's like the movement provided an outlet for their energy and their desire to create a more just and compassionate society.
Exactly. And women's involvement in the progressive era went far beyond settlement houses. They were also at the forefront of the movement for women's suffrage.
Right, the right to vote. That was a huge battle.
What were some of the arguments for and against women's suffrage back then? It's hard to imagine people actually opposing it now.
I know, right? But at the time, it was a very controversial issue. Those opposed to women's suffrage often argued that it would disrupt the natural order of things, that women were too emotional to be involved in politics, and that their place was in the home, not the voting booth.
Yeah, those arguments sound pretty outdated now.
They do, but they were deeply rooted in traditional gender roles and a fear of social change.
So how did the suffragists counter those arguments?
Oh, they pointed out that women were already active in their communities, working for social reform and contributing to society in countless ways. They argued that denying them the vote was a violation of their fundamental rights as citizens and that it hindered the progress of the nation.
It's interesting how they framed it not just as a matter of women's rights, but as a benefit to society as a whole. Exactly. They argued that women's voices were needed to create a more just and compassionate society, that their perspectives and experiences were essential for addressing the complex issues of the day.
And they ultimately succeeded, right? The 19th Amendment was passed in 1920, granting women the right to vote. That must have been a huge victory for the movement.
It was a landmark achievement, a testament to the dedication and perseverance of countless women who fought tirelessly for decades to secure this fundamental right.
But I imagine the fight for equality didn't end there. Even with the right to vote, there were still so many barriers facing women, especially women of color.
Absolutely. The passage of the 19th Amendment was a crucial step, but it was just the beginning of a long and ongoing struggle for true equality.
It's like those incremental steps we were talking about earlier. Progress rarely happens overnight. It's a constant push forward, even when it feels like you're facing insurmountable obstacles.
And that's a theme that runs throughout the entire progressive era. It was a time of both incredible progress and persistent challenges, of victories won and battles still to be fought.
Now I'm curious about the relationship between the progressives and the Victorian establishment. We talked about how the progressives were challenging Victorian values, but were they completely at odds with each other? Or was there some overlap, some common ground?
That's a really interesting question, and it's not a simple answer. On the one hand, you definitely have this clash between the old and the new, between traditional values and progressive ideals. But on the other hand, it's important to remember that the progressive movement didn't emerge in a vacuum. It grew out of the very society it was critiquing.
So in a way, they were both products of their time, shaped by the same historical forces, even if they had different visions for the future.
Exactly. And I think you see that reflected in some of the ways the progressives frame their arguments. For example, while they challenged the Victorian emphasis on individualism, they often appealed to Victorian notions of morality and social responsibility to make their case for reform.
So it's like they were using the language of the establishment to challenge the establishment itself.
That's a great way to put it. They were able to tap into some of those deeply held Victorian values and reframe them in a way that supported their progressive goals.
That's pretty clever.
Yeah.
And it probably made their message more palatable to a wider audience. It's like they're saying, hey, we're not trying to throw everything out the window. We're just trying to make things better, to live up to our own ideals.
Exactly. And I think that approach was key to their success. They were able to build coalitions to persuade people from different backgrounds to come together and support their cause.
You know, one of the things that strikes me about the progressive era is how much they accomplished in a relatively short period of time. It's like this burst of energy and reform that swept across the nation. How did they manage to achieve so much, given the resistance they faced?
That's a great question. And I think there are a few key factors that contributed to their success. One was the sheer force of their conviction. They were deeply passionate about their cause, and they were willing to fight tirelessly to achieve their goals.
Mm-hmm. They weren't just armchair activists. They were out there on the front lines, organizing protests, lobbying lawmakers, educating the public.
Exactly. They understood that change wouldn't happen on its own. It required sustained effort and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
And it wasn't just about their passion. They were also incredibly strategic.
Absolutely. They were skilled at building coalitions, leveraging the power of the media, and framing their arguments in a way that resonated with a broad audience.
It's like they were masters of public relations before public relations was even a thing.
That's a great way to put it. They understood the importance of shaping public opinion, of getting people on their side.
And they were also willing to work within the system to use the tools of democracy to bring about change. They weren't just protesting in the streets, they were also running for office, passing laws and reforming institutions from the inside out.
Exactly. They recognized that lasting change required not just activism, but also engagement with the political process.
So it was a multi-pronged approach. Grassroots organizing public awareness campaigns, legislative reform, all working together to create this wave of progress.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the most important lessons we can learn from the progressive era. It's a reminder that change doesn't happen overnight. It requires sustained effort, strategic thinking, and a willingness to work both inside and outside the system.
Now, throughout our discussion, we focused primarily on the successes of the progressive era. But it's important to remember that it wasn't all smooth sailing. They faced setbacks, internal conflicts, and unintended consequences.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
No historical movement is without its flaws. The progressives, despite their best intentions, sometimes made mistakes or enacted policies that had unintended consequences.
Can you give us some examples?
We'll take prohibition, for example. While the goal of reducing alcohol consumption was admirable, the way it was implemented led to a rise in organized crime and a disrespect for the law. It ultimately backfired, and the amendment was eventually repealed.
It's a reminder that good intentions don't always translate into good outcomes, and that even well-meaning reforms can have unintended consequences.
Exactly. And I think it's important to acknowledge those complexities to avoid romanticizing the past or presenting the progressive era as some kind of utopian ideal.
It's about learning from both the successes and the failures, right? Taking those lessons and applying them to the challenges we face today.
Precisely. The progressive era offers a wealth of insights into the dynamics of social change, the challenges of reform, and the importance of both vision and pragmatism. It's a reminder that progress is an ongoing process, a constant struggle for a more just and equitable society.
Speaking of a more just and equitable society, we've talked a lot about the social and political reforms of the progressive era, but I'm curious about the economic side of things. What were they doing to address the issue of economic inequality, the gap between the rich and the poor?
That was a central concern for the progressives. They recognized that social justice was inextricably linked to economic justice.
So it wasn't enough to just give people the right to vote or access to education. They also needed to address the systemic factors that were keeping people trapped in poverty.
Exactly. They saw economic inequality as a threat to democracy, arguing that concentrated wealth gave a small elite too much power and influence over the government.
So what were some of the specific economic reforms they championed?
They pushed for things like progressive taxation, where the wealthy pay a higher percentage of their income in taxes. They also advocated for government investment in public infrastructure, like roads, bridges, and schools, to create jobs and stimulate the economy.
It sounds like they were trying to create a more balanced system, one where the benefits of economic growth were shared more broadly across society.
Exactly. They believed that a strong middle class was essential for a healthy democracy, and they saw government intervention as a way to create the conditions for a thriving middle class.
Now, I imagine these ideas were pretty radical back then, given the prevailing laissez-faire philosophy. Did they face a lot of pushback from those who believed the government should stay out of the economy?
Absolutely. The debate over the role of government in the economy was a central theme of the progressive era, and it's a debate that continues to this day.
It's interesting how these same questions about the balance between individual liberty and collective responsibility, between free markets and government regulation, are still so relevant today.
It shows that the legacy of the progressive era is very much alive. It continues to shape our understanding of the relationship between government, the economy, and society as a whole.
And I think that's one of the most important takeaways from McGerr's book. It's not just a history lesson, it's a call to action. It reminds us that the fight for a more just and equitable society is an ongoing one, and that we can draw inspiration from the struggles and triumphs of those who came before us.
Absolutely. The progressive era offers a roadmap for how to create positive change, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the social, political, and economic reforms of the progressive era, the challenges they face, and the legacy they left behind. But I'm curious about one more thing. We've talked about the big picture, but what about the everyday lives of people during this period? What was it like to live through this time of such rapid change and upheaval?
Yeah, it really was a time of profound transformation. I mean, you had all these new technologies popping up, cities were exploding in size, and then there was this whole movement for social and political change happening at the same time.
Yeah, it must have been pretty wild to live through all that. I mean, I'd love to get a sense of what it actually felt like to be an American during that period.
Well, McGerr really does a great job of capturing that. He goes beyond just like the big events and the political stuff, and he really dives into the daily lives of people from all walks of life. You know, the rich, the poor, everyone in between.
Okay, so let's start with the upper crust. The folks living those lavish lifestyles that we often associate with the Victorian era. What was their world like?
Well, imagine a world of, opulent mansions, elegant balls, a very strict social hierarchy where your reputation was everything.
Oh yeah, those Victorians were all about appearances.
They really were. And these were families often with, deep roots going back to the early days of America. They wielded enormous power, both economically and politically.
So they were like the movers and shakers of society.
Exactly. And their lives revolved around, social engagements, philanthropy, and of course, maintaining their status within this very exclusive circle.
It sounds kind of like a gilded cage in a way. All that wealth and privilege, but also all those social pressures and expectations.
Yeah, there was definitely a sense of that. And, it's interesting because McGerr shows how even among the elite, there was this tension between upholding those traditional Victorian values and adapting to the changing realities of the time.
So some of them were clinging to the old ways, while others were starting to embrace new ideas.
Exactly. Some were very much committed to those traditional ideas about family and gender roles, the whole separate spheres thing with men in the public realm and women confined to the home.
Right, but others were starting to question those norms.
Yeah, they were, especially some women. They were getting involved in social reform movements, pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable behavior for women of their class.
So even in that world of privilege, there were cracks starting to appear in the facade of Victorian society.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And those cracks were even more evident in the lives of the working class. Imagine working long hours in factories, living in cramped tenement housing, just a constant struggle to make ends meet.
It's a completely different world from those fancy mansions and elegant parties we were just talking about.
It really is. And that contrast, that stark inequality, was a major source of tension during the Progressive Era.
Yeah, I can see how that would fuel a lot of anger and resentment.
Absolutely. The Progressives saw this inequality and felt compelled to act to try and create a more just and equitable society.
But what was daily life actually like for working-class families? Did they have any time for leisure or community amidst all that hardship?
That's one of the things McGerr does so well. He doesn't just paint a picture of unremitting misery. He shows how, even in the midst of poverty and struggle, working-class communities found ways to create moments of joy and connection.
So it wasn't all doom and gloom.
No, it wasn't. For example, saloons played a central role in working-class life. They weren't just places to drink. They were social hubs where people gathered to share news play games and find a sense of community.
It's kind of like their version of social media, I guess.
Exactly. And dance halls were another popular form of entertainment. They offered a chance to let loose, enjoy music and dancing, and forget about their troubles for a while.
It makes you realize that even in the toughest of times, people need those moments of release, those opportunities to connect with others and find some joy.
Absolutely. It speaks to the resilience of the human spirit. The ability to find hope and meaning even in the face of adversity.
Okay. So we've explored both ends of the spectrum, the elite and the working class. But what about the folks in between the growing middle class? What was their experience of the Progressive Era?
Well, the middle class was really at the heart of the progressive movement. They were the teachers, the shopkeepers, the small business owners, the professionals. They were benefiting from the economic growth of the era, but they were also witnessing firsthand the social problems that came with it.
So they were kind of caught in the middle, seeing both the promise and the perils of this rapidly changing society.
Yeah, exactly. And many of them were drawn to the progressive cause. They believed that they could use their newfound influence to create a better world for themselves and for their children.
So they were really the driving force behind a lot of those reforms we've been talking about.
They were.
Yeah.
And their involvement was crucial to the success of the movement. They lent respectability to the cause, they mobilized public opinion, and they put pressure on politicians to actually do something.
It's fascinating how this one period in American history can be so full of contradictions. You have all this progress and innovation, but also all this inequality and struggle. You have hope and optimism, but also disillusionment and despair.
Yeah, it's definitely a mixed bag. And I think that's what makes it so compelling to study. How do you make sense of all these competing forces? How do you reconcile the good with the bad?
And ultimately, how do we learn from this period? How do we apply those lessons to the challenges we face today?
Well, I think one of the key takeaways from McGerr's book and from our discussion is that the Progressive Era was not some sort of utopian ideal. It was a time of real struggle and real achievement. And the reformers themselves were not perfect. They made mistakes, they had blind spots, but they were also deeply committed to making the world a better place.
And that's a really important message for us to remember today, because we're still grappling with many of the same issues that the progressives faced, inequality and justice, the role of government in society.
Exactly. And their story reminds us that change is possible, that even in the face of really daunting challenges, ordinary people can make a difference.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Victorian era and the rise of progressivism, I want to leave our listeners with this thought. What lessons can we learn from the progressives? How can we apply their insights, their strategies, their spirit to the challenges we face in our own time?
Because the fight for a more just and equitable society is a never-ending one. And it's up to each of us to carry that torch forward.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into a truly fascinating period in American history. We hope you've enjoyed it and that you'll continue to explore the legacy of the Progressive Era and its relevance to our world today.